Tensions are on the rise as reports in the Israeli media indicate a return to a multi-front war could be close. Security officials are warning that the Islamic Republic of Iran is continuing to advance its nuclear weapons program, and the IDF have begun preparations for a potential strike against Iran's nuclear facilities. Hezbollah in Lebanon is rebuilding and rearming as the deployment of the Lebanese army in the south stalls, and the terror group issued an ultimatum to Israel: completely withdraw by February 18th or else. The IDF is set to withdraw from southern Lebanon tomorrow, but said it will remain in key strategic points. And in Gaza, Hamas is stifling the humanitarian aid going into the Strip and trying to extort and control the rehabilitation efforts in Gaza, ensuring their continued control and involvement. As such, the IDF remains on high alert on all fronts and is making preparations should the fragile ceasefire agreements fail. Today marks 500 days of war, 500 days since our world was turned upside down. Let's not forget how this war began. It began on October 7th when Hamas broke the existing ceasefire, committing the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. 1,200 people, Israelis and nationals from countries around the world, were raped, tortured, and murdered, and hundreds were taken hostage into Gaza. 500 days later, and 73 hostages remain in captivity, held in the darkest dungeons of Gaza without food, without sunlight, tortured, injured, and their time is running out. Hamas orchestrated and perpetrated these acts, but it was not alone. Thousands of Palestinian civilians from Gaza also took part. And one day after October 7th, Israel was attacked again, this time from the north, from Hezbollah in Lebanon. And let's not forget the Houthis, Islamic jihadists in Iraq and Syria, and of course the head of the octopus, the Islamic Republic of Iran, who attacked Israel in the largest ballistic missile strike in history. And throughout this seven-front war, throughout Israel's existential war, the world was silent. Silence from the United Nations, silence from many Western leaders, silence from human rights groups, silence from women's rights groups, just silence. And worse than silence were condemnations from the UN, kangaroo courts, hundreds of thousands taking to the streets not to call for the release of the hostages, not to demand for Hamas and Hezbollah to surrender, no, but to accuse Israel of genocide, to call on Israel to stop defending itself, to lose the war. And with these calls and the weak leadership displayed by world leaders came the rise of anti-Semitism, the age-old phenomenon in a new form. And Jews are once again being targeted around the world simply for being Jews. But despite all of this, despite everything, in these 500 days of war, the IDF and Israel's security forces were able to launch incredible operations. Who can forget the beeper attack? But these came at a heavy price. Over 800 soldiers, brothers, sons, husbands, fathers, killed in combat. We don't forget their heroic sacrifices. And Israel, for the most part, has stood alone. It's had some help from allies, but not enough. And today, 500 days later, we continue to see the strength of the people of Israel. We see their resilience. Israel is beginning to rebuild, to rehabilitate. A change in leadership that has finally brought the moral clarity that was so sorely lacking since October 7th. Our allies, especially the United States led by President Trump, is standing alongside Israel unequivocally and is demanding change, not from Israel, but from Hamas and its allies, demanding an end to the status quo that brought us to this day. 500 days in, we are in the midst of a ceasefire. The axis of resistance is severely weakened, but the war is far from over. It will not end. We will not be able to move on until Israel sees the return of all the hostages and Hamas is eliminated once and for all. But today there is finally optimism, and there is hope. And speaking of hope, the Security Cabinet is meeting at this hour to discuss the second phase of the ceasefire for hostage agreement with Hamas. The meeting comes after U.S. Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff said Phase 2 talks are getting underway to bring all the hostages home. More on this from ILTV's Steve Leibovitz.
For now, an Israeli negotiating team is in Cairo to coordinate details relating to the ongoing Phase 1 of the agreement. A Phase 2 negotiating team would be dispatched to Doha following expected Security Cabinet approval. The meeting of the Security Cabinet was ordered after U.S. Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff spoke to Netanyahu and told Fox that second phase talks will get underway in Doha.
Phase 2 is absolutely going to begin. I've actually had calls this morning, I can tell you, with Prime Minister Netanyahu, with Prime Minister Mohammed from Qatar, and as well with Director Hassan from Egypt, who is their Director of Intelligence. And we had very, very productive and constructive calls this morning about the sequencing of Phase 2.
Witkoff explained what the U.S. expects from Phase 2.
It just is a little bit more intricate and complicated in terms of how we bring the two sides together on this, because Phase 2 contemplates an end of the war, but it also contemplates Hamas not being involved in the government.
Netanyahu will try to get the approval to enter Phase 2 talks without losing the right wing of his coalition, strongly opposed to talks to end the war in Gaza. The Prime Minister's office said Israeli negotiators to Doha would receive guidance on the second phase only after approval at the Security Cabinet meeting. Netanyahu is facing mounting domestic and international pressure to move forward with second phase talks to bring all the hostages home and bring an end to the war in Gaza.
Told Bibi, you do whatever you want because, my statement was they got to come back now.
The Trump administration clearly wants the Phase 2 negotiations to bring the hostages home and end the war in Gaza. Both Israel and the U.S. agree that Hamas cannot be left in power in post-war Gaza. Trump has made clear that if a deal cannot be made, the U.S. would support an Israeli return to war. Trump is also continuing to advance his plan for the Gazan population to be resettled and for the U.S. to take over and rebuild under its control. Israel may now be entering into Phase 2 talks, but chances of their success are far from certain.
500 days into the war, and we're joined by Fleur Hassan Nahum, Foreign Ministry Special Envoy and former Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem. Fleur, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
So 500 days today, it's hard to explain the mixed emotions here in Israel today. But can you try to give our viewers a sense of what Israelis are experiencing today, sort of the mood in the country today?
Well, I think that it's trauma and disbelief. Disbelief that 500 days after the worst attack that has ever been seen in Israeli sovereign territory, we're still here. There are still hostages that haven't returned home. Hamas is still on its feet. It's almost unbelievable that we've practically destroyed Hezbollah. The Syrian government of Assad has toppled down, and yet here we still are trying to get our hostages home. So I think there's trauma, there's exhaustion, there's sadness, there's disbelief. And for us, 500 days is bad enough, but imagine if you're in a dungeon and you've been there for 500 days, it's like being there in eternity.
Absolutely, and now we're seeing a push for Phase 2 of the talks underway. Many here in Israel, even President Trump himself, have expressed skepticism about this second phase. I mean, what is happening now? Are we going to try and see perhaps Phase 1 extended? And is Israel willing to make any further concessions to Hamas?
Well, I think it's not even about concessions anymore. I don't think how many more concessions could we have given. We're leaving the Netzarim crossing, which is the crossing between south and north of Gaza, essentially letting Hamas go back in there. We've given back murderous terrorists, 30 to 40 to 50 per hostage. And so I don't see what more we can concede on. But I think President Trump is correct in the sense that he doesn't want this drib-drabbing of hostages coming out, a few every week, 3 every week. That's national torture. He's saying, well, why can't you get more out quicker? And why can't the second stage be a continuation of the first stage? And I think he's right. And I think he's also pushed up the stakes for Hamas, because now they're not only talking about Hamas staying in power. I think it's very clear to everyone Hamas can't stay in power. But the question now is, who's going to control Gaza after Hamas? And I think by pushing up those stakes, he's making it, please God, more likely for the hostages to come home, all of them.
And what about his promise that all hell is going to break out if the hostages aren't returned? Why is Israel hesitating here to carry this out?
Well, you know, when you're in government, you can never win. If Netanyahu would have said, okay, I'm going with President Trump's all hell, we would have gone back to full-scale war, and we may have never gotten any hostages out. And so when we knew we had the lives of those 3 hostages, plus the rest of them that are supposed to come out on stage 1, I think the responsible thing that Netanyahu did was to try and make sure that Hamas actually complied with the deal that they signed rather than let all hell break loose. I think President Trump was very clear that it was in Israel's hand. And he achieved the result, because remember that last week on Tuesday or Wednesday, Hamas said they weren't going to be releasing those 3 hostages. So whatever it is that Trump said, however it is he said it, it worked to at least get the first phase of the deal back on track.
Mm-hmm. At 500 days in, you know, we have to mention the fact as well that there's a new president in the White House, President Trump. He's, you know, hit the ground running. He's placed immense pressure on Egypt, on Jordan, and on the Arab world as well to take in Palestinians from Gaza. He's put forward this plan, and now we're seeing sort of a new Egyptian plan beginning to formulate as well. Do you think Trump's Gaza plan is likely to be implemented? Has this all been a bargaining tactic? I mean, what can we expect moving forward?
Well, whatever he is, it is that he did. He changed the conversation, and he opened the conversation about the day after in Gaza. Remember that before that, when we were seeing the scenes of these hostages coming home emaciated, looking like Holocaust survivors, we had kind of wouldn't dare, nobody was daring to say the obvious, which is that Hamas cannot rule Gaza the day after, even when we saw them on their feet. And then Trump came and said, not only are they not going to rule Gaza, but we're going to rule Gaza. And the UAE ambassador, Yusuf Al-Otaiba, said very clearly on TV, well, Trump's plan is the only plan. If anybody else has a plan, go ahead. And then what happens? Egypt comes up with a plan. And then yesterday, what do we hear? Saudi Arabia has a plan. So whatever it is that President Trump did, he changed the conversation. He made it perfectly clear to the entire Arab world that Israel will not tolerate, and America will not tolerate Israel living next to the rule of Hamas. And all of a sudden, everybody's laughing at his plan 1 minute, and everybody's coming up with different plans the next minute. So he actually moved something.
And that's certainly what we need right now. Fleur, thank you so much for your analysis today.
Thank you so much.
For generations, owning a home in Eretz Yisrael has been a cherished dream, one of faith, heritage, and belonging. Now, with Sparta Real Estate, that dream is within reach. From the spiritual heart of Jerusalem to the vibrant Jewish life of Vernana, the seaside beauty of Netanya, or the energy of Tel Aviv, Eliyahu Kleinman will guide you every step of the way. With beautiful homes at various price points and all bureaucracy handled for you, it's never been easier. Scan the QR code now, and Eliyahu will personally help you find your home in Israel.
And last night, at the opening of the Conference of Presidents' 50th anniversary mission to Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu delivered a strong message of unity with the U.S., backing President Trump's Gaza plan and reaffirming Israel's commitment to defeating Hamas and preventing a nuclear Iran. ILTV's Mayan Hoffman was at the event. Let's take a look.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu delivered a powerful message on Sunday to the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations. He emphasized that Israel is stronger than ever and expressed full support for U.S. President Donald Trump's plan for Gaza and the region.
We see eye to eye with the U.S. administration, President Trump and his administration, first of all, on accomplishing the immediate 3 goals that we have in Gaza. One is to achieve the release of all our hostages. The second, as I said, is to destroy Hamas. The third is to ensure that Gaza has a different future. That President Trump has presented a bold new vision and the only plan that I think can work to enable a different future for the people of Gaza, for the people of Israel, for the surrounding areas. Why not give Gazans a choice?
Netanyahu highlighted Israel's successes in Lebanon and Syria, but acknowledged that more work remains in Gaza, likely referencing his earlier discussions with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, signaling that Israel may need to return to Gaza in the near future to fully eliminate Hamas, which still controls the territory. He also delivered strong remarks on Iran, calling it the world's leading sponsor of terrorism. The Prime Minister left the room energized and committed to working with Israel to turn this vision into reality.
The Prime Minister coming here is an indication of his commitment to maintaining the dialogue and making his voice heard and helping to explain the policies to the leadership of the American Jewish community. I believe we are on the cusp of major changes in the Middle East.
And I think the Prime Minister is 100% correct to say we stand with the United States and with President Trump in this bold new vision of the Middle East.
The 5-day conference brought around 65 delegates to Israel, fewer than in recent years, but including top leaders from North America's Jewish community. Along with site visits, delegates will meet with Knesset Speaker Amir Ohana and other MKs to discuss key issues important to U.S. Jews.
What's weighing on the American Jewish community, and it's not a monolithic community, but what's weighing on us is, number one, is making sure that the hostages can be brought home. And also, what's the country, how is the country going to come back from this? And what can we do to help that country come back from this?
And joining us now in the studio is Maayan Hoffman. Maayan, so you were at the event and spoke to a certain senior U.S. diplomat who gave a very powerful message. You want to share with us?
Yeah, well, Lidar, I did have a conversation on the sideline of event that was some of the events that were going on in Israel this week, and a senior U.S. official was able to share that despite all the discussions about potentially going back to Gaza, despite phase 1, phase 2 negotiations, all of the hostages will be coming out of Gaza as per the instructions of U.S. President Donald Trump. The message that I received that was when Trump means business, he means business, and that is non-negotiable. So Israelis whose loved ones are still trapped in Gaza should be able to feel confident that they will come out, period.
Some good news for a change. Thank you, Maayan. And the families of the hostages marked an eerie milestone of 500 days since their loved ones were kidnapped by Hamas terrorists into Gaza. Today, they held a 500-minute fast to commemorate the somber day, as they still fight to get them back home. ILTV's Shosh Bedrosian reports in Hostages Square with the details.
Lidar, it is hard to imagine that 500 days ago, more than 250 people were kidnapped and dragged into Gaza, and 73 families had no idea that 500 days later they would still be fighting for their loved ones to be released and returned back here to Israel. Right here where I'm standing in Hostage Square, this has been the central location for the fight to get these people back home, and today this is where they're located. The families of released and still captive hostages fasted for 500 minutes today from 11:40 a.m. to 8 p.m. and closed out the fast in Hostage Square to mark the painful day. For 500 days, 73 hostages have endured depths of hell in the darkness of Gaza, with released hostages sharing testimonies of starvation, being shackled for hundreds of days, hung upside down, burned, hidden in tunnels, isolation, sexual violence, and psychological mental torture. 3 male hostages recently released walked out of Gaza emaciated, barely having the strength to hold themselves up. The stories have been harrowing to hear, as the 141 released hostages have been able to provide clues and bits of information for those still locked away in Gaza. The Israeli public continues to learn the heroic and resilient survivors of Hamas captivity, such as female soldier Liri Albag, who is credited for defending other hostages and understanding the psychology of her captors to survive. Other released hostages like Aviva Siegel shared her experiences with the world to advocate for the hostages to be released, including her husband, American-Israeli citizen Keith Siegel, who was released 2 weeks ago.
When I was in Gaza, I lived in constant fear for my life and for my personal safety. I was starved and I was tortured, both physically and emotionally. When the war intensified, the terrorists who held me treated me even worse than usual. Terrorists kicked me, spat on me, and held me with no water, no light, and no air to breathe.
The nation has also mourned with the families whose loved ones were murdered in captivity. The parents of American-Israeli Hirsch Goldberg Poland captivated the world as they advocated for the release of Hirsch with poise, dignity, and conveying messages of peace. Hirsch was murdered in September after 11 months of captivity. His body was found with 5 other hostages inside a tunnel in Rafah. 8 hostages were rescued alive by IDF in special operations, including Noah Argamani, who has become a prominent figure. Her kidnapping was caught on camera, and she's now an advocate for the release of her boyfriend, Avi Natan. As for those still in Gaza, the family of Shiri Ariel and Kafir Bibas are holding out hope they will return home soon. The 3 were supposed to be released weeks ago, but Hamas has not provided an update or status on their conditions. Yarden Bibas was recently released as part of the current ceasefire hostage deal. The families of hostages finished their 500-minute fast today right here in Hostage Square, all of them pleading for the rest of the hostages to be returned as part of the Phase 1 and Phase 2 of this deal, as there's growing skepticism if officials in Israel actually want it to come to fruition.
Thank you, Shosh. And 500 days since the start of Israel's war against Hamas, and thousands are still unable to return to their homes in the south. But stepping up is the Tekuma Directorate. ILTV's Ariela Luchiani has the details.
The OTEF, Israel's Gaza border region, is home to tens of thousands who have long lived under the shadow of conflict. 500 days after the October 7th attack, the OTEF is still rising from the ruins. The Tekuma Directorate has committed nearly $2 billion to rebuild the communities that suffered the worst devastation. Kibbutz Be'eri, Kfar Aza, and Nir Oz, once symbols of thriving communities, were among the hardest hit. They, along with 7 other towns, are receiving $310 million for reconstruction. 3/4 of the total funding is dedicated to physical rebuilding, homes, schools, medical centres, and public spaces. Of the 64,000 residents displaced by the attack, 83% have now returned. But for 13 communities, home is still out of reach, either due to security concerns or the extent of destruction. In Be'eri, Kfar Aza, Nir Oz, and Holit, full reconstruction won't be complete until the end of 2026. Beyond rebuilding, Tekuma is investing in resilience. Schools and hospitals are being reinforced. New security infrastructure is in place to ensure that no family has to endure such horror again. The land is being cultivated once more, businesses are reopening, and industries are receiving the support needed to revive local economies. More than $100 million have been directed towards agriculture, technology, and small businesses, giving the region a chance to flourish again. The scars of October 7th remain, but the OTEF is not defined by destruction. It is defined by resilience, by determination, and by the unbreakable spirit of its people. These communities are not just returning, they are rebuilding stronger than before. No attack, no destruction will erase them. The OTEF is here to stay.
And now, let's take a look at the weather forecast. Clear skies are expected around most of the country tonight, with temperatures reaching lows of around 10 degrees Celsius or 49 degrees Fahrenheit. Then tomorrow we'll see sunny skies alongside steady temperatures with highs of 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's a wrap for today's news. For the latest updates from Israel on all your devices, be sure to follow our ILTV channel, subscribe to our newsletter, and explore our website, iltv.tv. Stay informed with the latest news straight from the heart of Israel. I'm Madar Gravelazi. Be well, stay safe, and thank you so much for watching.